This week's guest, Desmond Meade. He is a civil rights activist now based out of Orlando. He spearheaded the constitutional amendment to Florida law back in 2018, Amendment 4, which allowed the establishing of voting rights for all adult citizens in Florida, even convicted felons, except those convicted of murder and sexual offenses. It reenfranchised some 1.5 million people in Florida. He is the executive director of the Florida Rights Restoration Council, author of Let My People Vote, My Battle to Restore the Civil Rights of Returning Citizens. And just this fall, he was distinguished as a 2021 MacArthur Fellow, which, if you're not aware, is sometimes referred to as the Genius Grant. It is essentially the American MVP for social do-gooders, an astonishing recognition for his work with voting rights in Florida.
Well, and an amazing cap to a rather remarkable life story.
Incredible.
He's done. So
yeah,
let's get to it.
Let's do it.
Where did you grow up, and how influential was, I gather your mom was really influential in your life and in the ultimate outcome of it.
I grew up in South Florida, primarily Dade County. But I was born in the U.S. Virgin Islands, on the island of St. Croix. Moved over to, in Dade County at a very young age, and that's where I spent most of my years. And you are right. My mother was very influential in my life. A couple of the things that that's always stuck with me. One was about just the importance of education. Right. And say that, man can take a lot of things away from you, but the one thing he can't take is your, whatever you've learned or your knowledge.
True.
And then the other thing that I loved, and I was just sharing with someone the other day, my mom, I never forget when my mother told me this, and she said, it's better to be quiet and have people think that you're a fool than to open your mouth and confirm it.
Now, how did you wind up in the Army and then facing the difficulties that you went through?
Well, the reason why I joined the Army, man, I was I think a junior in high school, and Rambo was playing in the movie theaters. And let me tell you, after seeing Rambo, I just knew I wanted to be Rambo. And, I tried to join the Marines, but they wouldn't let you sign up early. But the Army had what they called the delayed entry program at the time.
Oh, yeah.
And so it allowed people who are not yet 18 to actually sign up. And then when they turn 18, they could go ahead and enter into the service. And so that's what I did. Rambo was my motivation. I at some point, in the middle of my senior year in high school, I tried to reconsider other options, because I was playing football then. But, we had there are some recruiters that's out there that's just out there to meet their quota. And they'll do anything to meet the quota. And I had one of those recruiters that told me that if I backed out of the delayed entry program, that I can go to prison. And,
oh, boy.
So, yeah, he scared me into honoring the commitment. And so I went into the military, did pretty well. But like most of my problems, if not all of them, stem from substance abuse. And, eventually, my addiction to drugs, which developed when I was in the military, caused me to eventually get court-martialed.
Oh boy!
Yep.
And then you got out, and then we're still battling with your addiction. And to some criminal charges. I
think I in my book, Let My People Vote, I talk about that constant battle, right, between right and wrong, and like when I was in high school, I'm very smart. But no one wanted to be the nerd. I wanted to be the jock, and sure. So there was a constant battle there. Then when I went into the military, I did extremely well, man. I received medals of honor. I had some real nice distinctions. I was Soldier of the Quarter, where I beat out so many soldiers in a 45th support group. But yet there I was getting court-martialed. And so it was like, night and day, salt and pepper, but it was that constant struggle between good and evil.
Yeah.
And when I was released, that same it was that same struggle. My heart wanted to do good, but I had an addiction that led me down the wrong track.
Yeah. And some drug priors, and then a kind of specious gun charge where you were framed for pointing a gun at police that you didn't actually own. It's a long story that is detailed in your biography. We won't necessarily get into here, but that's how you yourself winded up in the prison system.
Yeah.
And that led to your activism now to bring voting rights and civil rights to felons once they've been released. Talk about when that turn was made of your life sort of spiraling downward through drug addiction and incarceration to rebounding into becoming a prison yard lawyer and activist and ultimately MacArthur Fellow.
Listen, we don't have enough time. The quickest way to tell that story is just to tell somebody to get the book. Right? Let my people vote. But let me just clear a little something up, Chad.
Yeah.
That the incident that you referred to with the possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, I can tell you that no one pointed a gun at the police. I didn't even have a gun on me, right? And you could just imagine, especially even with what we see today, if someone's pointing a gun at the police, chances are they're not going to be living to talk about it.
Good
right?
point.
But no, it was a gun that was found in the house that I was staying in, and the actual owner of the gun was actually there. But through some circumstances and the fact that I think what really happened was that the police, they actually kicked in the wrong door to the wrong house.
Oh my!
And so it just so happened that I was the only one in the house with a prior felony conviction. And so the story was that they were driving down the street and they heard a woman scream, and they went into a yard and they allegedly seen me holding a gun. Nobody in the house, but I'm holding a gun. Or in my room, I should say. And that's what caused him to kick down the door.
Wow.
And even though everything else did not add up, at the end of the day, I was sentenced to 15 years in prison. But I went to prison and I didn't do 15. Coincidentally, I would have been getting out of prison the same year that I actually graduated with a law degree.
Wow.
Right. And I like to share that. I always like to talk about that piece because when I talk about the amount of money that the state of Florida, tax dollars that they would spend to house people in prisons, right, was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars they would have had to spend for me. And then I would have gotten out. And of course, with nothing there, what have I would have gotten out to? And that was basically nothing. But rather than spending those 15 years in prison, I only spent 3. So I saved the state of Florida tax. Matter of fact, I could say I saved Florida taxpayers a ton of money by working on my case and actually turned it around. And rather than me just sitting up in the prison, rotten or learning how to be a better a criminal or whatever, that what I ended up doing was end up coming out, going through some low points to where I was in front of railroad tracks waiting on a train to come so I could jump in front of it. Once again, nice. Drug addiction, right? But to actually get help, right? And that's the thing. The thing that turned me around was not prison, was not spending thousands and thousands of dollars of taxpayers' dollars, but the thing that turned me around was being able to go to a drug treatment, right? And have certain like a homeless program in South Florida, Chapman Partnership, that was able to house people and help people get on their feet, right? To be able to have that really helped me just turn the corner and end up becoming an asset, not only to the state of Florida, but to this country, to the world.
Yeah. What made you decide to go into the field of law, to go to law school?
Well, while I was in drug treatment, I had an epiphany, and I realized that the thing that, I was chasing the joy that I didn't even know I was chasing, that I didn't even know existed. right? And basically what I equate that joy to is really understanding or discovering the purpose in my life.
Mhm.
And I realized it was so simple. It was just to give back,
Hmm.
right? Everything in nature takes a little and gives a little, right? And so it was about how do I use my experiences, right, in a way that would help others, that would help our society, right? And so I dedicated my life right off the bat saying, you know what? I'm going to wake up every day, right? And I'm going to ask God to give me strength, stamina, wisdom, and perseverance to just do his work. And his work is to make the community a little bit better, even if it's just something as simple as making someone smile, right?
Mhm.
Giving someone some type of hope. And so that's what I committed myself to. And then when I enrolled in the paralegal program at Miami-Dade College, I discovered that law is so intertwined in every aspect of our lives.
Mhm.
And I figured that if I really want to help people, I should have a better understanding of the law. Not that I wasn't expecting to practice law, but
Yeah.
having an understanding of the law would help me help other people, to help them navigate through, whatever it is that they're going through. And so that's why I decided to apply to law school. And fortunately, I was accepted.
How did that lead you to Amendment 4? At what point did you say, I need to change the law and help people like me get the right to vote?
Man, let me tell you, that moment came, I think, the first quarter of 2011. Rick Scott just got in office, him, Pam Bondi, Jeff Atwater, and Secretary of Agriculture, Adam Putnam.
Yes.
And I remember the year before when they were campaigning, because I think Scott ran against Alex Sink.
Mhm.
And nothing was ever brought up about clemency. It was on no one's radar. But for some reason, the first thing that the cabinet did when they got into office was revise the clemency policies, right? And I remember during that hearing when Adam Putnam asked, well, what research are you basing these new recommendations on? And they basically looked at him and said, you need to shut up, right? It's interesting because what we found was that even that year during the campaign, a private prison industry invested a lot of money into those campaigns.
Yeah.
Right. And so then I realized that they could have been driving some of these policy changes, and particularly around the restoration of civil rights, where they undid the policies for no reason and made it even more difficult for people to be able to have their rights restored. As a result of that policy change, I could tell you that there are people right now today in 2021 that still are waiting to have a hearing to see whether or not they could have their rights restored.
Wow.
Right? It's been that long. But when I seen how a politician, through just a stroke of a pen on a piece of paper, can determine which American citizen get to vote and which American citizen don't get to vote, it blew me away. And I thought that was way too much power for any politician to have, whether they're Democrat, Republican, or whatever. No politician should have that much power, because that leaves a lot of room for partisanship or partisan politics to actually influence the determination of who gets to vote.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to clarify, prior to Amendment 4, your Amendment 4 passing in 2018, it was largely up to the governor's discretion, each incoming administration, how clemency and voting rights for felons and convicts worked?
Yes.
Wow.
And basically Florida policy is anyone convicted of a felony offense, any felony offense, faced a lifetime ban, right, from voting and having their civil rights restored. A lifetime. You lost it for the rest of your life. And it could be something as simple as releasing helium-filled balloons in the air. And I'm pretty sure one of you guys have already done that before. I'm almost sure that one of you guys have. or disturbing turtle nesting.
I had an alibi. I swear.
Listen, trespassing in the construction site, or a pier, burning a tire in public, driving with a suspended license, all kinds of stuff. Any felony whatsoever, or writing a check that bounced. We had a guy, Howie. He was a veteran, and he just wanted to feed himself. Went to the grocery store, bought about $300 worth of groceries, and he wrote a check and it bounced. For 30 years he was trying to get his righteous story.
Well, when you think about, and you get in a bar fight as a teenager, you steal a car, you're daredevil, reckless driving. I mean, there's any number of embezzlement, non-violent sort of crimes of youth, foolishness and for that you're going to have
desperation.
Right.
Yeah.
Your voting
you catch a lobster. You can't. Well, but here's the thing, right?
Yeah.
So I don't even like to distinguish between violent and nonviolent, because here's the deal. 95% of people who are incarcerated are coming home. And so if you have a person with a less serious offense and a person with a more serious offense, and they're both released, let's stop and think about it. Do we want to make it harder for any one of them to successfully reintegrate back into their community? No. And to be carry their fair share of tax burden? No, whether you're a serious offender or not or not a serious offender, if you're released back into my neighborhood, I need you to be successful, right? Because I might end up being your next victim. And if you're making it easy for the less serious people, and you're making it harder for the ones with the most serious crimes, then all you're doing is increasing the likelihood that the seriousness of their crimes escalate.
Yeah. Well, and you, once you're out, you've paid your debt to society, so to speak. This is not supposed to be a life sentence. And, voting is a civil right. As you say, regardless of what your crime is, when you get out, you shouldn't have your civil rights taken away from you just because of something you've done previously.
Chad, let me tell you, I have 4 boys. I don't know if you guys have sons.
Yes,
right?
I do.
Too.
So know that it's guaranteed that they're going to do some boneheaded thing. We know this, right? I have 4 of them, right? So, and let me tell you something. And it dawned on me one year that no matter what my sons do, they never stop being my son, right? And there's nothing that speaks more to citizenship than being able to vote. Yeah. Right. In Maine and Vermont, a person never loses their right to vote. In countries all around the world, people never lose their right to vote. Right. And even in Puerto Rico, prisoners were able to vote during the presidential preference primaries. Wow. And so I believe that if there's no other greater indicator of citizenship than being able to vote, that at the end of the day, you shouldn't lose that. You should.
So how hard was it to go from the idea of we should restore people's rights to vote to actually getting Amendment 4 passed in 2018?
Very hard. but it was a good kind of hard.
Yeah.
Right.
Good trouble.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you why it was a good kind of hard. There was a lot of sweat, blood, and tears that went into that. But the process was so beautiful because we were able to bring people together along the lines of humanity. We had white, black, Spanish, Asian Pacific. We had Democrats. We had Republicans. We had independents. We had people who didn't give a damn either way, right? But they cared about humanity. And we brought all of these different groups of people together. We brought the Jewish community. We brought the Islamic community. We brought the African-American church. We brought the Latino evangelicals. We brought the white evangelicals. We brought the white churches. All came together and said, let my people vote. And so the process was beautiful because we were able to accomplish a major win, and we didn't have to engage in tactics to tear people down. We didn't have to instill fear in anyone or hatred in anyone. That we actually were powered. If nothing else, we were powered by love. And so when the 5.1 million people voted yes on Amendment 4 in November of 2018, man, that was a beautiful moment that showed the world that love can, in fact, win the day.
Yeah. Wow.
But then But then the
Go ahead.
legislature
Yep.
stepped in and kind of
yes,
ruined
they
the
did.
whole thing, right?
I call it the arrogance of a politician, that the arrogance that a lot of these elected officials have, like they're smarter than everybody else and they're the only ones that know the right way to do something or what should be done. But here the irony of it was that Florida had 150 years to get this thing right. You know, over the last 20 years, none of these folks really stepped up and said, let's do something. And so I equated it to these politicians walking past a homeless family for years. And this family is out there in the rain, sleet, and snow, right? And the politician does not lift a finger to help them. But the people in the community, which I believe is the second greatest act of democracy, when the people take their power back and say, okay, if you can't do it, we're going to do it ourselves, and through a citizens initiative. And the people of the community came together and they decided that they were going to build a home for this family. And after they built the home, it was the arrogance of a politician to walk in the house and demand that they determine how the house is furnished.
Yeah. That's a good
comparison.
Really?
But that is what you didn't do anything about rights restoration for all these years. You never been a champion of it. You never spoke for it, you know, and some of them you spoke against it. But now that we won, now that the people of Florida spoke, now you want to interpret what they really meant and how you should furnish it. No, you should stay out of it.
Yeah, their interpretation is related to a financial penalty or paying some kind of restitution, which is simply a modern day poll tax. Explain for folks who are not up on the issue, and myself included, what the restrictions the Florida legislature put on your Amendment 4 in 2018 to try and cut the knees out from under it.
Yeah, part of this is a common sense argument. Other part is a legal argument. I guess you can get a bit of both. Everything really hinged around, what does completion of sentence mean? And what we, where we stood was that we understood that there were some financial responsibility that was going to be attached to your sentence. And it was very clear. There are two types of financial responsibility: those that are punitive in nature, and then those that are administrative in nature. And what we believe, and I say we rightfully believe, is that legal financial obligations that are administrative in nature are not part of a sentence, right? Yep. What's part of a sentence is if you violate a statute, and written within that statute, it explicitly says your violation of this statute can leave you liable to pay $500. Or if matter of fact, Chad, maybe you broke Craig's car window to get his iPad, right? You're mad at Craig. You think it's really your iPad. You break his car window, you get his iPad. The statute that governs you breaking into his car says that you could be sentenced to a year in jail, up to 2 years in jail, and up to $500 fine. And so at the time of sentencing, the judge says, I'm going to sentence you to a year in jail, and I'm going to order you to pay a $250 fine. In addition to that, it cost Craig $200 to repair that window that you broke, right? And so I'm also going to order you to pay Craig $200 in restitution. Those are punitive in nature. But all of these fees and these costs, those are just the cost of doing business in court, right? And so the fees were mechanisms that Florida legislature came up with many years ago, right? Because they didn't want the responsibility of figuring out how to fund the courts. So they said, you know what, we'll create this fee mechanism so you could fund yourself. And when they did so, they knew that the fees that were going to be assessed to people who cannot afford to pay them. Yeah. So it was a shell game. And so those are the things that really drive a lot of the cost up and create this almost seemingly insurmountable obstacle for people to be able to vote. And those are the things that the Florida legislature said, okay, no, let's put it all together. and say you got to pay these off before you can actually register to vote.
Which is not what people voted for. I know we're running out of time. I just have to ask you before we end, what's the status with your own voting rights? I was really confused about what happened with that recently.
Yeah. So when Amendment 4 passed, right, I got the right to vote. And in January of 2019, I went and I registered, became a registered voter. And so I was good there. But Amendment 4 only dealt with the right to vote. Before Amendment 4, the right to vote was packaged in civil rights. And so in order for you to get the right to vote, you had to have your civil rights restored. The restoration of civil rights does more than just vote. It really impacts your ability to get housing, your ability to get a job, right? So for instance, even though I graduated law school, I couldn't apply to the Florida bar because you can't apply until your civil rights have been restored.
Right.
I never owned a home in my life. You can not own or even rent a house in a lot of subdivisions until your civil rights have been restored. So even though I got the right to vote back in November of 2018, I still, because I didn't have the rest of my civil rights, I still had to face these other collateral consequences. You know, just recently, I was able to get my civil rights restored. So now, if I desire, I could sit for the Florida bar. You know, now I can buy a home for my family. Now I could even run for office because now the rest of my civil rights have been restored.
Here's hoping. That's not something I'm at all familiar with. And again, that shows kind of my privilege and background. How does this loss of civil rights work and equally the restoration of your civil rights after you go through the prison system?
Well, it's not even after you go through the prison system, because a lot of people just associate the restoration of rights with people coming out of prison.
Okay.
The reality is it's the conviction that triggers the loss of your civil rights. And so technically, there is still a lifetime ban on your civil rights once you've been convicted of any felony conviction, whether or not you go to prison. And just understand that less than 25%, I believe, of people who are convicted of a felony offense are even sentenced to prison.
Just think about lost their civil rights. Yeah.
Yeah. So every year I remember at one point, Florida was averaging over 177,000 people getting convicted of a felony offense each year.
Jeez.
Wow.
But you only had about maybe 30,000 going to prison. And so a lot of folks, they could be your neighbor and you never know. People in your church, at your job, who have lost their civil rights for the rest of their life because of something maybe that they did 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Desmond Meade, Let My People Vote is the book. We'll have links to all of Desmond's writing and the organization and his website, social media, everything, so folks can follow you moving forward. Thank you so much for your time. Congratulations on the honor and continued success with your work.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Craig, that's such an enlightening conversation. I'll, peel something back here and say, both you and I are white. I have had no contact in my family on either side with the prison system. Fortunate to say that. You're talking about a world there that is totally foreign to me. The idea that you lose your civil rights, you can't stand for the bar if you've been incarcerated or been convicted of a felony. I didn't know until recently that you couldn't vote ever again, in Florida if you had been convicted of a felony. That is, such a different world. But I'm glad Desmond is out there shining a light, because it is utterly unfair for these people who go through that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I used to cover criminal courts, so I knew already about the loss of voting rights. Not that that's a big deterrent for anybody committing a crime. It's one of those things where after you're convicted, you look back on it and go, okay, I regret it now. Mm-hmm. But that's it's not like, you commit a crime, you go to prison. It's not like a deterrent like that. Mm-hmm. And you have to wonder how this kind of got started and why it's been perpetuated, and maybe which political party benefits and which doesn't from that.
Well, but the loss of voting rights is clearly a descendant of Jim Crow laws.
Oh, yeah. Well, but I did not know about the rest of it. I didn't realize that the loss of your civil rights meant more than just the right to vote. It meant, his inability to buy a house and sign a mortgage. That was incredible. I did not know that.
Yeah. So you start thinking about, again, he talked about some amusing sort of fish and wildlife, catching a lobster or, probably keeping, too many fish, those sort of, behaviors which are felonies. Yeah. But again, I just, for my own self, get in a bar fight, drunk, steal a car, do something stupid, DUI, there are a lot of felonies that I don't think anyone would believe you should be punished by the loss of your civil rights for the remainder of your life. And
a lot of it's just stuff you do because you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and it's not something you would do intentionally by any means.
Like Desmond said, or you're just a young, dumb male, and you and I can speak from experience there. There are any number of situations I could have been involved in had I only been caught, not for the grace of God, that kind of thing. And then, that should not be, a lifetime sentence. The loss of voting rights for 70 years because something you did at 20 when you were all hopped up.
Because you tossed an alligator through a drive-through window.
Right. But, it really goes to show that there are all these layers of society and experiences that if you don't share, you have no idea about. And thankfully for Desmond, there are people out there doing this kind of work. And, unfortunately for Desmond and the people doing this kind of work, again, as we've talked about before, another example of the legislature coming in and saying, Florida citizens.
That's not what you meant to do. That's not what you meant to do. You meant to do this. Yeah.
And it was overwhelmingly passed, and the legislature just came in and said, no, we'll interpret how this should actually be. And again, another attempt to stifle and along political lines, you can imagine who they're trying to prevent from voting and why, to put another barrier up in front of someone exercising one of those civil rights, which is just appalling.
Yeah, but that's our legislature. As I wrote recently, even on a good day, they can seem nuttier than a grove full of pecan trees.